11th century, the Pope campaigned for a crusade to gain control of the Holy Land in the Near East. A crusade is a holy war. The Pope encouraged Christian soldiers to travel east to fight the Muslims. As flocks of crusaders arrived in these lands, they discovered manuscripts of ancient societies that were being preserved. These texts from ancient Mediterranean cultures, referred to as classical texts, contained writings of Greek and Roman scientists and philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. Before the Middle Ages, classical texts were only available to those who could read and write, which included mainly only clergy. Monks copied many of these texts in order to preserve them, but not to spread knowledge. Population in Western Europe had also increased and led to a demand for an increase in literacy to help with record-keeping. The Church could no longer meet the educational needs of the times, and learning moved into the secular community. Access to education and to the classics grew quickly. As people learned to reason and exchange ideas with each other, the Church saw a decline in its influence over them. Some scholars tried to merge classical knowledge with church doctrine. However, many people recognized the abundance of wealth and power held by the Church as corruption. Some groups began to call for reform within the Church. Monastic orders during this time created their own independent communities. Monasteries owned large tracts of land and had a tendency to become very wealthy. Monasteries received gifts and donations from those hoping to be granted salvation from the monks. The wealth of the Church caused people to feel as though they were becoming separated from the clergy. Urban cities began developing more quickly, creating larger numbers of homeless and sick people. Numbers became so large that the parish churches were no longer able to deal with them. In response to the growing number of needy and a distaste for the wealth accumulated by churches and monasteries, mendicant orders began to form. Mendicants were monks who wanted to emulate the life and suffering of Jesus by living without any possessions. Mendicants gave up their homes in monasteries and all their possessions to live in the streets. From the street, they would hear confessions of people and preach. Many who felt distant from the Church formed a new connection with the mendicants in their area. One of the most well-known mendicants is named Francis of Assisi. Francis was born into a wealthy family and had an extravagant childhood. Around 1205, he was moved to give up everything he owned. He began rebuilding churches that had been destroyed. Around 1210, Francis met with Pope Innocent III to share his beliefs and ask for his blessings. Although he didn't receive formal approval for his efforts, the Pope did encourage him. The Order of the Franciscans received the formal approval of Pope Honorius III in 1223. Franciscans were known for their emphasis on poverty. Although their actions weren't a major cause for reform within the Church, people felt the order held certain credibility without the power attained through wealth. Franciscans also took vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity. Eventually, the issue of poverty will cause conflicts within the Franciscan order. In 1322, the Pope even condemns the doctrine of poverty as heresy in conflict with established doctrine. Another major order of mendicants called the Dominicans was founded by Dominic Guzman of Spain. Dominic was experienced in preaching, and although he did place emphasis on poverty, the main goal of his order was to preach. He was specifically interested in reaching out to the Cathars, who were considered heretics. Cathars believed all tangible things were evil and all spiritual things were good. Indirectly, this means they rejected the holiness in Jesus' life and death. Dominicans were encouraged to be well educated. These two orders were recognized as two of the 5 great mendicant orders and were given looser restrictions to their property. Other recognized mendicant orders were the Carmelites, the Servites, and the Augustinians. As Catholicism grew in popularity throughout Europe, the Church gained more power and wealth. However, as Crusaders returned with new classical knowledge and literacy increased, people gained the ability to reason without Church influence. Many grew unhappy with the resulting corruption and separation with lay people. Mendicant orders began not in opposition to the Church, but in favor of a simplistic lifestyle that mimicked that of Jesus. Mendicants went to the streets to reach out to people, to preach, and to take confession. They aided the sick and the poor. Two of the most well-known orders were the Franciscans and Dominicans. Although no major reform within the church resulted, they did revive a more positive attitude in the middle and lower classes towards Catholicism. In Europe, the Middle Ages was a time period that spanned from around the 5th century until around the 15th century. This is a time considered between antiquity, think of the ancient Romans and Greeks, and modern periods. The Middle Ages can be divided into 3 separate time periods: the Early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. For this lesson, we will focus on how people learned and were taught during the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages lasted from the 11th century through around the end of the 13th century. During this time period, crop production increased quickly because of some new technology. Agricultural advances led to an increase in the population of Europe. Also during this time, a military campaign pushed Christians to gain control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. Fighting occurred at intervals for years. These holy wars are known as the Crusades. In large part because of the Crusades, the High Middle Ages also experienced a rediscovery of classical knowledge. When using the term classical, we are generally referencing ancient Greece, especially ancient Greek scientists or philosophers like Aristotle. People living in ancient cultures were curious. They wondered about the stars and the human body. They developed mathematical practices. People who lived near the Mediterranean Sea, like the Greeks, studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Essentially, they were studying wisdom. Romans wrote about literature, history, and politics. One of the